Welcome to story time. Tonight we're going to read Welsh Rabbit and the Hunted Hares. Long, long ago, there was a good saint named David who taught the early Cymric or Welsh people better manners and many good things to eat and ways of enjoying themselves. Now, the Welsh folk, in speaking of their good teacher, pronounced his name Tafydd, and affectionately Taffy, and this came to be the usual name for a person born in Wales. In our nurseries, we all learned that Taffy was a Welshman, but it was their enemies who made a bad rhyme about Taffy. Wherever there were cows or goats, people could get milk, so they always had what was necessary for a good meal, whether it were breakfast, dinner, or supper. Milk, cream, curds, whey, and cheese enriched the family table. Were not these enough? But Saint David taught the people how to make a still more delicious food out of cheese, and that this could be done without taking the life of any creature. Saint David showed the girls how to take cheese, slice it and toast it over the coals, or melt it in a skillet and pour it hot over toast or biscuit. This gave the cheese a new and sweeter flavour. When spread on bread, either plain or browned over the fire, the result in combination was a delicacy fit for a king and equal to anything known. The fame of this new addition to the British bill of fare spread near and far. The English people, who had always been fond of rabbit pie and still eat thousands of molly cottontails every day, named it Welsh Rabbit, and it is thought that it was one of the best things to eat. In fact, there are many people who do not easily see a joke, who misunderstand the fun, or who suppose the name to be either slang or vulgar, or a mistake, and who call it rarebit. It is like the Cape Cod turkey, codfish, or Bombay ducks, dried fish, or Irish plums, potatoes, and such funny cookery with fancy names. Now, up to this time, the rabbits and hares had been so hunted with the aid of dogs that there was hardly a chance of any of them surviving the cruel slaughter. In the year 604, the Prince of Powers was out hunting. The dogs started a hare and pursued it into a dense thicket. When the hunter with the horn came up, a strange sight met his eyes. There he saw a lovely maiden. She was kneeling on the ground and devoutly praying. Although surprised at this, the prince was anxious to secure his game. He hissed on the hounds and ordered the horn to be blown, for the dogs to charge on their prey, expecting them to bring him the game at once. Instead of this, though they were trained dogs and would fight even a wolf, they slunk away howling and frightened as if in pain, while the horn stuck fast to the lips of the blower, and he was silent. Meanwhile, the hare nestled under the maiden's dress and seemed not in the least disturbed. Amazed at this, the prince turned to the fair lady and asked, "Who are you?" She answered, "My mother named me Monacella. I have fled from Ireland when my father wished to marry me to one of his chief men, whom I did not love. Under God's guidance, I came to this secret desert place, where I have lived for 15 years without seeing the face of man." To this the prince in admiration replied, "O most worthy Melengesh," which is the way the Welsh pronounce Monacella, "because, on account of thy merits, it has pleased God to shelter and save this little wild hare. I, on my part herewith, present thee with this land, to be for the service of God, and an asylum for all men and women who seek thy protection. So long as they do not pollute this sanctuary, let none, not even prince or chieftain, dragged them forth. The beautiful saint passed the rest of her life in this place. At night she slept on the bare rock. Many were the wonders wrought for those who with pure hearts sought her refuge. The little wild hares were under her special protection, and they are still called Melangesh's lambs. The end. Tonight we are reading story number 2, The Mighty Monster Afang. After the Cymric folk, that is, the people who call Welsh, had come up from Cornwall into their new land, they began to cut down the trees to build towns and have fields and gardens. Soon they made the landscape smile with pleasant homes, rich farms, and playing children. They trained vines and made flowers grow. The young folks made pets of the wild animals' cubs, which their fathers and big brothers brought home from hunting. Old men took rushes and reeds and wove them into cages for songbirds to live in. While they were draining the swamps and bogs, they drove out the monsters that had made their lair in these wet places. These terrible creatures liked to poison people with their bad breath, and even ate up the very little boys and girls when they strayed away from home. So all of the face of the open country between the forests became very pretty to look at. The whole of the Cymric land, which then extended from the northern Grampian hills to Cornwall, and from the Irish Sea past their big fort, afterward called London, even to the edge of the German Ocean, became a delightful place to live in. The lowlands and the rivers in which the tide rose and fell daily were especially attractive. This was chiefly because of the many bright flowers growing there, while all the yellow gorse and pink heather made the hills look lovely as a young girl's face. Beside this, the Cymric maidens were the prettiest ever, and the lads were all brave and healthy, while both of these knew how to sing often and well. Now there was a great monster named the Afang who lived in a big bog hidden amongst the high hills and inside of a dark, rough forest. This ugly creature had an ironclad back and a long tail that could wrap itself around a mountain. It had 4 front legs with big knees that were bent up like a grasshopper's, but were covered with scales like armor. These were as hard as steel and bulged out at the thighs. Along its back was a ridge of horns like spines and higher than an alligator's. Against such a tough hide, when the hunters shot their darts and hurled their javelins, these weapons fell down to the ground like harmless pins. On this monster's head were big ears, halfway between those of a donkey and an elephant. Its eyes were as green as leeks and were round but scabbed on the edges like squashes, while they were as big as pumpkins. The Afang's face was much like a monkey's or a gorilla's, with long straggling grey hairs around its cheeks like those of a walrus. It always looked as if a napkin as big as a bath towel would be necessary to keep its mouth clean, yet even then it slobbered a good deal, so that no nice fairy liked to be near the monster. When the Afang growled, the bushes shook and the oak leaves trembled on the branches as if a strong wind was blowing. But after its dinner, when it had swallowed down a man or 2 cows or 4 sheep or a fat heifer or 3 goats, its body swelled up like a balloon. Then it usually rolled over, lay along the ground or in the soft mud, and felt very stupid and sleepy for a long while. All around its lair lay wagon loads of bones, and of the creatures, girls, women, men, boys, cows, and occasionally a donkey which it had devoured. But when the Afang was ravenously hungry and could not get at these animals, and when fat girls and careless boys were scarce, it would live on birds, beasts, and fishes. Although it was very fond of cows and sheep, yet the wool and hair of these animals stuck in its big teeth. It often felt very miserable, and its usually bad temper grew worse. Then, like a beaver, it would cut down a tree, sharpen it to a point, and pick its teeth until the mouth was clean. Yet it seemed all the more hungry and eager for fresh human victims to eat, especially juicy maidens, just as the children like cake more than bread. The Cymric men were not surprised at this, for they knew their girls were very sweet, and they almost worshipped women, so they learned to guard their daughters and wives. They saw that to do such things as eating up people was in the nature of the beast, which could never be taught good manners. But what made them mad beyond measure was the trick which the monster often played upon them by breaking the river banks and the dikes, which great toil had been built to protect the crops. When the waters overflowed all their farms, ruining their gardens and spoiling their cowhouses and stables. This sort of mischief the Afang liked to play, especially about the time when the oat and barley crops were ripe and ready to be gathered to make cakes and flummery, that is, sour oat jelly or pap. So it often happened that the children had to do without their cookies and porridge during the winter. Sometimes the floods rose so high as to wash away the houses and float the cradles. Even those with little babies in them were often seen on the raging waters and sent dancing on the waves down the river to the sea. Once in a while, a mother cat and all her kittens were seen mewing for help, or a lady dog howling piteously. Often it happened that both puppies and kittens were drowned. So, whether for men or mothers, puppies or kittens, the Cymric men thought the time had come to stop this monster's mischief. It was bad enough that people should be eaten up, but to have all of their crops ruined and animals drowned, so that they had to go hungry all winter with only a little fried fish and no turnips, was too much for human patience. There were too many weeping mothers and sorrowful fathers, and squalling children and animals whining for something to eat. Besides, if all the oats were washed away, how could their wives make flummery, without which no Cymric man is ever happy? And where would they get seed for another year's sowing? And if there were no cows, how could the babies or kitties live, or any grown-up person get buttermilk? Someone may ask, why did not some brave man shoot the Afang with a poisoned arrow, or drive a spear into him under the arms, where the flesh was tender, or cut off his head with a sharp sword? The trouble was just here. There were plenty of brave fellows ready to fight the monster, but nothing made of iron could pierce that hide of his. This was like armor, or one of the steel battleships of our day, and the Afang always spit out fire or poisoned breath down the road up which a man was coming, long before the brave fellow could ever get near him. Nothing would do but to go into his lair and drag him out. But what man or company of men was strong enough to do this, when a dozen giants in a gang, with ropes as thick as a ship's hawser, could hardly tackle the job? Nevertheless, in what neither man nor giant could do, a pretty maiden might succeed. True, she must be brave also, for how could she know but if hungry the Afang might eat her up? However, one valiant damsel of great beauty, who had lots of perfumery and plenty of pretty clothes, volunteered to bind the monster in his lair. She said, "I'm not afraid." Her sweetheart was named Gadern, and he was a young, and strong hunter, he talked over the matter with her, and the two resolved to act together. Gadern went all over the country, summoning the farmers to bring their ox teams and log chains. Then he set the blacksmiths to work, forging new and especially heavy ones to make of the best native iron from the mines for which Wales is still famous. Meanwhile, the lovely maiden arrayed herself in her prettiest clothes, dressed her hair in the most enticing way, hanging a white blossom on each side over her ears, with one flower also at her neck. When she had perfumed her garments, she sallied forth and up the lake, where the big bog and waters were, and where the monster hid himself. While the maiden was still quite a distance away, the terrible Afang, scenting his visitor from afar, came rushing out of his lair. When very near, he reared his head high in the air, expecting to pounce on her with his iron-clad claws, and in one swallow make a breakfast of the girl. But the odours of her perfumes were so sweet that he forgot what he thought to do. Moreover, when he looked at her, he was so taken with unusual beauty that he flopped at once on his forefeet. Then he behaved just like a love-lorn beau when his best girl comes near, who ties his necktie and pulls on his coat and brushes off the collar. So the Afang began to spruce up. It was real fun to see how a monster behaves when smitten with love for a pretty girl. He had no idea how funny he was. And the girl was not at all afraid, but smoothed the monster's back, stroked and played with its big moustaches, and tickled its neck until the Afang's throat actually gurgled with a laugh. Pretty soon he guffawed, for he was so delighted. When he did this, the people down in the valley thought it was thunder, though the sky was clear and blue. The maiden tickled his chin and even put up his whiskers in curl papers. Then she stroked his neck so that his eyes closed. Soon she had gently lulled him to slumber by singing a cradle song which her mother had taught her. This she did so softly and sweetly that in a few minutes, with its head in her lap, the monster was sound asleep and even began to snore. Then quietly, from their hiding places in the bushes, Gadern and his men crawled out. When near the dreaded Afang, they stood up and sneaked forward very softly on tiptoe. They had wrapped the links of the chain in grass and leaves so that no clanking was heard, and they also held the oxen's yokes so that nobody or anything could rattle or make any noise. Slowly but surely they passed the chain over its body in the middle, besides binding the brute securely between its fore and hind legs. All this time the monster slept on, for the girl kept on crooning her melody. When the 40 yoke of oxen were all harnessed together, the drovers cracked all their whips at once, so that it sounded like a clap of thunder, and the whole team began to pull together. Then the Afang woke with a start. The sudden jerk roused the monster to wrath, and its bellowing was terrible. It rolled round and round, and dug its 4 sets of toes, each with 3 claws, every one as big as a ploughshare, into the ground. It tried hard to crawl into its lair or slip into the lake. Finding that neither were possible, the Afang looked about for some big tree to wrap its tail around. But all its writhings or plunging were of no use. The drovers plied their whips, and the oxen kept on with one long pull together and forward. They strained so hard that even one of them dropped its eye out. This formed a pool, and to this day they call it the pool of the ox's eye, as it never dries up or overflows, though the water in it rises and falls as regularly as the tide. For miles over the mountains the sturdy oxen hauled the monster. The pass over which they toiled and strained so hard is still named the Pass of the Oxen Slope. When going downhill, the work of dragging the Afang was easier. In a great hole in the ground, big enough to be a pond, they dumped the carcass of the Afang, and soon a little lake was formed. This uncanny bit of water is called the Lake of the Green Well. It is considered dangerous for man or beast to go too near it. Birds do not like to fly over the surface, and even when sheep tumble in, they sink to the bottom at once. If the bones of the Afang still lie at the bottom, they must have sunk down very deep, for the monster had no more power to get out, or to break the riverbanks. The farmers no longer cared anything about the creature, and they hardly ever think of the old story, except when a sheep is lost. As for Gadern and his brave and lovely sweetheart, they were married and lived long and happily. Their descendants, in the 37th generation, are proud of the grand exploit of their ancestors, while all the farmers honor his memory and bless the name of the lovely girl that put the monster to sleep. The end.